Good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and start. Sort of a challenge, it's a post-lunch challenge, but then you couldn't find two better speakers who will keep you entertained. No pressure at all. So good afternoon. My name is Vish Viswanath. I'm the Lee Compete Professor of Health Communications here at Harvard Chan School of Public Health with a cross appointment at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. I do a few other things. I have a lab where we focus on translational communications with a particular focus on translational communication is essentially to study and understand how evidence and science is translated to influence public health and practice and policy. With a particular focus on socially underserved groups, and we do our work globally. But that's not as interesting or important as the topic today and the speakers. The topic is titled Health Communications in a New Challenges in a Changing World. Now, in an era where the phrase alternative facts has entered the lexicon, which by the by are not facts, just to reinforce the idea. I think it's important to start with some real data and real facts to set the table, so to speak. If you look at the data, we are creating something like 2.5 quintillion data, every day, and on Instagram alone, about 95 million photographs and videos are updated every day. There are about 4.7 billion people on social media. About 60% of the world population is now on internet. About 4.5 billion people on social media. And approximately each of them spends on an average about 2.5 hours on social media on a variety of platforms, something like 7 to 8 platforms each, right? However, if you look at the data again, the news consumption pattern and information consumption pattern is also changing quite radically. And what is mysterious is where are they going for news? So look at the data. The proportion of people watching television is coming down, especially if they are looking for news. Proportion of people who are using print media is coming down. Proportion of people who are using social media for news has not increased. So it's bizarre, right? Where are people going for information? Particularly those of us who are in health are wondering, where are they getting the health information from if these media data remain stable or are falling, media exposure data, right? And of course, all this is backgrounded by two significant trends. One is inequalities. Despite these wonderful numbers that we see on increasing media consumption patterns of some kind or other, there are tremendous inequalities in accessing information and people's capabilities in acting on that information, particularly in health, fairly good evidence base, which parallels health inequalities that we see. That's a major issue. And these inequalities manifest within countries as well as across countries globally. And we have seen some of that during COVID-19. And the second is, in the latest data, until maybe 2 years ago, I was very smug about this because the data was so strong. But the latest data show that trust in institutions is falling. There has been a sudden shift just in the last year and a half or so. Particularly, if you ask globally, 90% of the people say they trust in scientists, 90% of them trust their physicians. But there has been a pronounced shift just very recently, right? So amidst this context, what do we do? What are the challenges in dealing with health communications or communicating health, whether to influence public health practice, regular citizens, or even policies. You can find two more qualified people to talk about it who bring extremely rich background and experience in addressing these issues in their day-to-day lives, in their professional backgrounds and practices. Amanda Yarnell, who is our Senior Director of Center for Health Communications, who has just joined us. I will let Amanda introduce herself too, because I can't do justice to her experience, but she has a lot of experience in communicating science and innovating new communication products to support that. And Jason Leitch from National Health Trust from UK across the pond, who was actually responsible for all the COVID-19 communications. That was an unenviable task, I would say, right? So what we will do is I will ask them some questions. They will be graded accordingly, I believe. So this is the afternoon. I have to joke. If you don't get it, what can I do? I will ask them to introduce themselves briefly so that their background becomes clear, and then answer the question. The first question is, given what is happening, what are the three significant challenges in health communications that we are facing? So we'll start with my immediate right, nothing to do with my ideology, but to my immediate right, Amanda, and then we'll go to Jason.
Hi, I'm Amanda, and as Vish said, new to here to Harvard Chan. I'm a chemist by training. I've spent the last 20 years of my career in science journalism, leading teams of writers, reporters, editors, as well as even marketers, developers, creators. So my background is largely in journalism, as Vish mentioned, media product innovation, and also in audience development. And I came here to Chan to reboot the Center for Health Communication, where we're hoping to refocus on defining, teaching, and sharing best practice in health and science communication. So very relevant to this conversation. Okay, so three challenges during COVID. Things that I would list first, we do not, as Vish mentioned, that the media environment that we live in today is incredibly skeptical, incredibly fragmented. I think we'll probably pick up on that theme later. But also at the same time, we really, I think science in general, public health, a part of this, does not necessarily train people to be great communicators. I certainly can vouch for that in my own scientific training. It was in fact my undergraduate training. I was a double major, entered a double major at Hopkins as a creative writing chemistry major. It's super unusual. That is how I learned to communicate. It was not a grad school at MIT. So that I would move more in a second. And third, I think during the pandemic in particular, we really prioritized efficiency in communication, or like pushing stuff out as fast as possible, and in the mix, I think, was lost. And that I think in the future needs to change.
So I'm Jason Leitch, and I have probably the toughest accent in the room. So if you need me to go slower, then choose another room.
Not compared to mine.
So I am the National Clinical Director of the National Health Service in Scotland. So I'm the Senior Clinical Advisor to the First Minister of the country and the Cabinet of the country. And during the pandemic, there were three of us. There was the Chief Medical Officer, traditional medical leadership and public health, a Chief Nursing Officer, nursing leadership, unsurprisingly, and a Clinical Director, and that's me. And I became, whether I liked it or not, hence the reason I end up in this room, I think I became the principal clinician on the TV. So I did 1,500 live TV and radio interviews over 2.5 years. I did a football phone-in every Saturday, literally, because there was no football. So, because I had shut down the football so that I could get on the radio. And I did kids shows, I did late night chat shows, pretty much everything you could possibly imagine on Scottish and UK television and radio. It's important to remember that the UK is made of 4 countries. We have independent health systems. There is the National Health Service, but it doesn't really exist anymore. There are now 4 versions. So I have a health minister who runs the Scottish health system, and the UK did collaborate, and we'll talk about maybe some differences in the communication between those 4 countries. The 3 challenges that come immediately to my head are pace, particularly during COVID. The science was changing sometimes during interviews, but literally during interviews. So the interviewer would tell me something new that I couldn't have possibly known when I started talking to them, which is quite an interesting phenomenon to be able to think as fast as that. Equity is a massive challenge everywhere where you communicate. In my world, that's principally economic equity, not racial equity. It changes depending on which country you visit, but we do have some hard to reach communities with information. In Scotland, that would be our Polish community. The most vaccine skeptic country in the world is Poland. Nobody really knows why, but we have a large Polish community who get their news from Polish radio and Polish TV that we had to access. We had to try and get me on Polish TV, which is an interesting phenomenon. And the third, I would say, and this might surprise you, is courage. Public health communication is not without cost, and we should be clear and tell people that if you do this and you communicate, particularly with the public, you need to be courageous when you do so, because it's not without cost for you and your family. And I think that's probably true in this country and in our.
Great, thank you, Jason. So I bet you are a very popular guy when you shut up football. So
I'm popular with, this is absolutely true, I'm popular with everybody over 70. So I get stopped in the street all the time by people who recognize me, literally all the time, every day. And young people walk up to me, and this happened 200 times. Are you Jason? I say, yes, I'm Jason, it's lovely to meet you. And they say, my granny loves you.
I was wondering whether I should be seen with you around Scotland or not after the football thing, but
I think you're my younger brother.
It's not all bad. Great. It's very interesting the way you juxtaposed these issues, raised a number of issues. So let me pick a couple of them. First, I want to pick about institutional structures, both from a production of information perspective. Actually, both of you are translators in some ways. And then you made the point, Amanda, about institutional structures are not designed for something like this. So from you alluded it to, Jason, that the facts were changing, the science was changing, but science always changes. You take the mess we have made with mammography as one example, right? The guidelines have changed over time. So what was different about COVID-19, and how did someone like you, who is in that position where you have to take the evidence and start communicating, adopted yourself?
Well, the difference is it was changing in real time, and it affected every single member of the population. Because for the first time in history, the world was told to stay in the house.
Right.
Pretty much every country in the world. The headlines of Sweden did it differently or South Korea did it differently are actually not true. Pretty much everybody ended up in their house. And therefore, depending on your culture and your environment, you were watching the news or getting your information from these kind of emergency communication devices. Now, we, in Scotland, we did daily press conferences at midday every day. That's what we did. We did it for almost 2 years, where the First Minister of the country would stand at a podium and speak to the population with a clinician standing at the podium beside her, translating the evidence. So the evidence was changing in real time, but we were doing it live on TV. That's not normal. And I hope we never have to do it again. And therefore, the amount of stuff you needed. So the guy at the podium was just the front man, just the guy who can talk out loud in a straight line. I didn't have to have any knowledge. I needed thousands of people to give me as much information as good. I had all the heads of public health on speed dial. I had a UK-wide network every Tuesday and Thursday night where we would meet as a set of clinicians. We'd decide on the advice at the moment in time. And then I would be the guy who had to try and translate that into a way that my mum and your mum would understand what it was we were saying, but also what we were asking you to do. Because that was, I mean, we shut down your business. We told you to not send your kid to school. We told you to, I mean, these are radical changes to the way society works. And we were trying to do this on television or on the radio with kind of, this is why we're doing it. There's been early work done on the Scottish communication versus the English communication. You won't be surprised who wins, or I wouldn't be raising it. No, the early work says England talked about war, a battle. We're gonna kill the virus. We're gonna fight together. That was the language they used every day. We talked about caring for your neighbor. We talked about looking after each other. We talked about we're all in it together. We're going to get out of this. And the language we used was entirely different. Now you can make your own judgment of which of those are right or wrong, but I know why we chose what we chose.
Excellent. So if you build on that, Amanda, you said something very interesting, that institutions are not there for something like that. Now you have been with institutions before COVID when science was being translated, but with some time on our hands to design appropriate communications. And then you have circumstances like this where you're doing it on the fly. So number one, tell us, what is the institutional structure that is so unsatisfying, that is not designed for it, and how do we overcome?
Yeah, I mean, I think just that, communications is not valued in general as part of scientific training. I think that cuts across a lot of places, including the School of Public Health. And not just here, but everywhere. We know it's of course challenging if it's happening in real time, but I think scientists, even in the best of days, they struggle to remove jargon. Jason is an exemplar here. Right.
You didn't have to listen to it every day. You should reserve.
But to remove jargon, to communicate with empathy, these are skills that generally we don't press people to practice. I think one of the biggest things that you saw during COVID, a challenge, was people not really understanding how to say I don't know, right? When we didn't know, right? So how to communicate uncertainty in a way that's satisfying, to the scientists, feels like you're doing the right thing, but also is satisfying to the audience, and in a way that you're continually driving, you're being authentic, but also keeping the person with you. And I think that goes to the trust issues that you've identified earlier in the talk, right? When people think that they're lying to you, because I think that's how often it comes across, even if that's not the scientist's intent, that's a thing that we don't practice as scientists as we come up.
I want to push you a little bit on a couple of these things. Now, you have experience both as someone who reports as a journalist, but also as a leader of journalism, right? I mean, as a manager. So I want to, and those roles are very different and sometimes conflicting roles. So I'm just wondering how, as a leader of an institution, as a manager of this process, how would you manage something? What went wrong with this? And then, because journalists have tried to do their best given the circumstance. I mean, I have talked to a number of reporters doing interviews, on this, and they were telling me they were doing 7, 8, 10 stories a day running, for several hours a day. So, right, there's a tremendous pressure on them, but also on managers. So I'm just curious if you take those two roles.
Yeah, it's interesting. Almost all of the journalists who worked before me, because I worked for a science news outlet, were scientists originally. So I think several things I would say. One, that there are different kinds of journalists, right? And science journalists in particular typically have scientific training in the background. And I think they came at COVID in a very different way than the generalist reporters. Every story became a COVID story, right? You were a business reporter. All of a sudden you're writing about COVID. You're a policy reporter. You cover courts. You're writing about COVID. Everybody is writing about COVID. And I think there's several things within journalism that makes that difficult. In the past, 20 years, science journalism had been on the decline. Many newsrooms had cut their science journalists. It was becoming increasingly sort of challenging to make a living out of that. And so you saw that, I think, really laid bare during COVID, the lack of that. But that doesn't mean there were journalists who weren't doing a great job. You know, what I would like to see in the future is every editor is obviously a generalist too, right? Like any editor at any newspaper or digital media outlet, they're a generalist because they have to edit lots and lots of people. And I think you see some of this coming up, which is good, training for editors as well as for journalists, which I think has been in place for a long time. And so that's a real positive. And you also see, I think, one thing COVID did in a positive in journalism, it did got a lot of people out of it, I think, because it was really challenging, but to go through running a newsroom or reporting. But one thing it did do is people are hiring more science reporters. You see a lot of, particularly in climate, for example, I think people are looking forward to the next public health disasters, the ones that are going on right now. Climate is a perfect example, and they're increasing investments in that area. So I just think there's some positives.
So let's stick to journalism for the next couple of minutes, and then I want to move to more institutions of journalism and communication. So we did a survey. I think ours was maybe the only survey of health journalists in the country. We didn't do it globally, but it was US data. And we found that in that survey, about 93% of the sample did not have any science background or so basic science background, right? Only 7% had any basic science background. And of course, now we all realize, science, some kind of scientific background is very important and critical. And we have been training something like, we trained about 225 journalists in India in a recent project around science journalism and public health journalism. The couple of challenges that we are facing, and I'm just curious how we can tackle that. I think so. One is a typical journalist who is trained in reporting on science and health is on that beat, say for a couple of years, right? So, and then they are moved to some other beat, right? You train them in science and medicine, then the next thing you know, 2 years later, they're reporting on sports or crime or some other beat, right? And so that's a real challenge. You're investing in them, right? And certainly it's not always. The other challenge we find is that they are also reporting on health and science, but they're reporting on something else in the same role, because not every setup is organized in a way that they can afford a health reporter or a science reporter. How do we address, what are the challenges with that? How do we address them? And then I want to go to Jason from his perspective, how do you handle it?
Yeah, I mean, I think journalism hasn't figured out how to handle that. I think there are a bunch of little experiments going on. It's unclear whether any of them will scale. So, for example, in California, the University of Berkeley is placing, specific journalists in newsrooms around the country to scale access in local newsrooms. I think that's really amazing, and they're using public money to do it. But is it a scalable thing in a global context? I think it's a question mark, a big question. There are other like citizen journalists type activities, I think, that have gone on in the participatory journalism area, where you work with audience members to prepare them to do journalism on behalf of their communities. And I think that's another area where, if I were betting, it would be a more scalable strategy.
That's very interesting. We should come back to this notion of citizen journalism and participatory journalism. But Jason, from your point of view, so you were on TV, on radio, you are the source that they are looking up to provide those facts, that evidence, but not just that. What does it mean? So what were your challenges? What did you think from your perspective? How did journalism perform? and
Well,
what could be done?
Well, in the UK, I think it performed remarkably well. The BBC is already public service broadcasting. We would suggest the best in the world. The only two things you're not allowed to criticise if you're not British are the National Health Service and the BBC. We complain about them all the time, but if you're a visitor, you're not allowed to complain about either of them. We hold them in astonishing high regard. And the BBC became, along with their colleagues in our more independent sector, what we would call Scottish television. We have an independent version that's paid for by advertising, rather than by all the members of the society. They all became public service broadcasters. And for 2 years, it became a push industry rather than a pull industry. Normally, media works by they phone you and ask you to go on. That's how it works. In COVID, we phoned them and told them we were coming on, and they did it. So actually, it was remarkable. We could say we need to speak to the nation at 8 o'clock, or we need to be on the phone in that you're doing tomorrow at 9 o'clock in the morning. Or Shetland, which is our island community, way north, closer to Norway than it is to Scotland. They get their news. The whole island gets the same news for 30 minutes every night on the radio. The whole island listens. They don't watch the mainstream TV because they think it's irrelevant, the mainstream news. So you have to be on that radio show. So I had experts, communication experts like Amanda, and I'm not one of them, who were able to manipulate the media in such a way that we were able to get on. Broadcast media, I think, did well. Printed media was much more of a challenge. It's much less specialized. It's much more generalist. And there's a number of lessons. One of the things you have to do is you have to give them the copy. They haven't got time to write 10 articles. It's impossible. If they're investigative journalists on a long story, they're not interested in your copy. But the health reporter in the Boston Globe needs your copy. And that means you've got to write it in such a way that they can almost take it word for word and put it in their newspaper. So you do the work for them, rather than them having to start from scratch. And you're much more likely. That's what the Press Association do. Every day, the Press Association convert what we've done into something they can then send. And you find yourself in the Frankfurt Times or the Gazette in the middle of the Caribbean because you've written this thing that is then translatable. So you have to learn to use it. The other thing my government minders didn't let me do this initially until they began to trust me more. I spoke to them informally. Now that's a big risk. You've got to be very careful. But once you started to trust who they were, so the BBC's health editor, I've known him for years. He's an absolutely lovely guy. He's very trustworthy. He's very factual. He was on the news every single night, speaking to the people of the whole of the UK. And I know him, and I would speak to him completely informally without any suggestion that he would break any security or cover or release something too early. None of that. You've got to choose those people carefully, but it can be done if you do it well. So I began to talk to them much more than I had talked to them before, and my own kind of communication minders eventually let me do that, although they were never entirely calm. The government minders are never entirely calm.
What did not work well?
What did not work well? Well, I think it's a good question. I think we probably sometimes under or over communicated. Because we were moving so quickly, we communicated in the generality to the whole population because we had to, because there was news every day, which meant that the African diaspora in Scotland who get their news from a different source, or the gypsy traveller community who don't have access to TV in the main and didn't have access to our vaccine clinics in a conventional manner. So we had to run to keep up with all of the different inequity that we were generating, partly through our communication. I learned a host of lessons. Sometimes I'm much more likely to overspeak than underspeak. You've maybe noticed that already. So I said in this is one example. In the October 2020, I was asked about Christmas, and it was October. What I should have said was, we don't know. What I did say was, prepare for a digital Christmas. That's what I said on the radio in the morning, on the big news program in the morning. Every newspaper the next morning was, Leitch says Christmas is over. Christmas is cancelled. Christmas is cancelled. Forget it. I was the, some of you will know the Sun newspaper in the UK. It's a real tabloid. I was the Grinch on the front of the Sun. So they had superimposed my face on the Grinch, and it just said Leitch cancels Christmas. So sometimes, even though it turned out I was right, Christmas was cancelled, if you remember, in December 2020. But saying it in October probably wasn't the right thing to do. So you have to choose what you're saying, as well as the timing of what you say. And sometimes on an individual level, I got the timing wrong.
So remind me to keep you off TV starting October.
And indeed.
The next few months. So that goes back to this notion of efficiency you raised. Is it the same as over communications, or what did you mean by efficiency?
Efficiency, very much what he was saying about, you're hitting the broadest possible audiences, right? And in focusing all your effort on that, missing the need to tailor to different communities within. I think, Jason put that very, very clearly as an example.
So that's what you mean.
Yeah, and I think that happens globally over and over, right?
And WHO did the same. The WHO did bi-weekly press conferences for the whole world. I mean, imagine trying to do a press conference on COVID for the whole world. I mean, it's preposterous. But they did a really good job. But they couldn't speak to the Thai challenge or the Scottish challenge. They had to speak to the broad challenge.
They hit the efficiency, right? They got the information out really fast.
But let me challenge you both. Since I have the platform, I can ask the questions. Right? So, what if you don't hold these press conferences? So you have this major crisis, global crisis. Institutions are closed, schools are closed, companies have sent employees home. There are banner headlines about the number of people infected, number of people dying, protests. In addition to partisanship, etc., etc. So, how much do you communicate or not communicate? What if you don't say anything? What will people say?
I mean, I wouldn't say there is such a thing as over communicating personally. There's poorly communicating, but there's not such a thing as over communicating. So, I think it's an and question, right? It's not an or question, it's a both. And in the run up to COVID, that trust with different specific audiences did not exist. You weren't able to plug into it. So efficiency was the easiest thing. I think, what I'm hoping people take from it moving forward is that cultivating those those relationships has a long lasting impact. And then when, this next big news cycle comes along and you need to get the information out, you do both things at the same time.
What do you think?
Well, we did polling every Friday. We polled the population about trust, about whether they were following the guidance, about whether they were watching the press conferences, about how they were getting on as a family, what was the financial situation, and trust in the remember, only half of the population vote for the government of the day, roughly, in our country. So about half of them support the existing government in charge. And our trust numbers were 80 to 85% for 2 years. I mean, that's quite astonishing globally. So actually, people wanted that level of information. There was a day near the end when my mum sent me a text message and I was about to go on and do a press conference with the First Minister, and she said, "I'm watching the tennis, I'm not watching today." And I realized maybe it was time to stop doing these anymore. If my mum has stopped watching, it's maybe there's nobody at the other end of that TV camera. And it was more therapy for the First Minister now than it was for anything else.
Great. I'm being warned. I was just about to go there, actually. I'm going to ask them one more question so that they can give you time to compose questions. We'll take audience questions from this point on. Do we have questions, Friendly? Oh, we already have a bunch of them. So I think I have to let them speak, right? Otherwise, I'll be in trouble with my dean who is there. And also Sana, and then someone here. Yes.
Thank you. It was great. My name is Sana Sayed. I'm a neurologist in Boston. I have a question for Jason. I'm wondering, in your role, you gained a lot of notoriety between, canceling Christmas, canceling football. I don't know which one is worse for Scotland.
Football is much worse. Much worse.
I wondering, did you receive any grants as well, personally? Because of course, it sounds like some of the investment in the US, and then just trying to compare the relative confidence of the two countries, and also considering how everything you approach communication differently. I think it speaks to their cultural context sometimes. So I'm just curious.
It's not frivolous at all. It's a really important question. And if you recall right at the beginning when I was asked what the 3 challenges were, one of the ones I chose for this room is courage. And if the Harvard School of Public Health is going to start to teach health communications in a more meaningful way, which I think it should, then one of the things it has to teach is the cost of communicating to the individual who does it. So I've had police check my locks. I've had personal protection when I've left the house. I arrived at a university just up the road to speak to the principal just a few weeks ago, and there were 2 security guards standing outside the room of the office before I went in because they'd had threats from students that were going to, principally anti-vax. It's not huge in Scotland. It's mainly Eastern Europe where most of that challenge comes from, and some of that drifts across to Scotland. I've had 3 direct death threats sent to me. I've had white powder in an envelope. I've had used masks with "I'm done" written on them, and if they'd left a forwarding address, I'd have written "me too" and sent it right back to them. I'm married to an English teacher, and the worst thing that happened, and I'm being slightly flippant, but the worst thing that happened was a gentleman from the north of Scotland decided to send me a grammar book because he had listened to me so often, and I had driven him so crazy. That was much worse for my wife than the death threats. She was much more concerned that I had got the grammar incorrect. But so I was very well looked after. We've got very good security services. I had very good advice, and the vast majority of people have been absolutely lovely. But there is a fringe, and that fringe, it doesn't appear to be actively dangerous. But when you're receiving that kind of stuff, it's difficult, particularly for my family. My sister is a hard-edged social worker in the middle of Scotland, and she dealt with my social media for me. So she banned people and reported people to Twitter and got people. So I never saw some of the worst of it. She actually quite enjoyed getting people blocked from social media.
I was going to
Yeah, I was going to say that
dealt with
journalism has been a thing for like quite a while, to be perfectly honest, especially if you're a female journalist. A lot of attacks online, not just in the US, but elsewhere internationally. And so, I mean, I personally had to deal with this as a newsroom leader, for example, having attacks and threats on my own staff after they published, a story that some of our audience did not like. And I think things I would take from that experience, first of all, in journalism, and I don't think this exists in public health, there are organizations, International Women's Media Foundation, Can America, that have put together packages of, basically safety guidelines and resources, things that you could do as an individual for yourself. They're also helping editors, so like the person's first line manager, their boss, basically, things that they could do. So I think Jason actually gave a real life example of that, something I've done myself, which is basically insert someone not neutral, but perhaps not, you're in sense, maybe not the right example, but I had an example where a reporter published a story and blocked the blowback from getting to her by inserting someone in the chain, right? Like somebody checked her email, somebody checked her Twitter, she stayed off of it, for example. And then the third thing I would say is that there's also needs to be an institutional response. So there's certainly some stuff that an individual can do, prevent yourself from doxing, for example. There's certain things that like your manager, your boss, your sort of immediate department could do to help you. But at some level, there has to be an institutional commitment as well. I was lucky enough to work in an organization where my overall publisher was really committed to that. And I had a colleague who was getting death threats from a paid member of our society. And the organization agreed to rescind their membership. So I think you have to have that level of commitment too. If you're going to treat somebody badly, that the institution is going to be looking as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you. Sorry, go ahead. Okay. I'm glad you raised the issues of gender and gendered roles. I want to come back to that. That's really critical. Not only journalists obviously, because I talked to a number of them, but also a number of public health practitioners, particularly women who face attacks and receive threats. That's a very critical point. Please go ahead.
So I have one serious question for Amanda, which is specifically mentioned that it's difficult for scientists to communicate. Maybe because we do so much facts and hard facts, but what would be your principal tip to people in the sciences who are trying to communicate to make?
Yeah, I think one is know your audience, right? So I think one of the major issues in science is because so many of us talk to science as your primary audience, right? So you're talking to other people who share your expertise, your background. So my primary thing I would advise is pick someone in your life who doesn't share that expertise. And when you are writing or talking or in any other way trying to communicate with a wider audience, think of that person. How would you frame the discussion for them?
My second question is for Jason. The CBD stuff as a land of the British Empire.
It does.
I thought this stuff was.
These are my principles. If you don't like them, I have plenty others. So the Groucho Marx said that wasn't me. So the UK wide award system, the honour system, which the Queen gives, is UK wide, not just England. So I met her 2 years ago, and she gave me my CB. It's one of the proudest days of my family's life.
Excellent. Go ahead, and then Carol, and then Mom. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Mohammed Abu. I'm 86. My question is to Jason. What the cost of communicating in compared to the entire health package we use for control the pandemic? So what exact percentage of money goes for communication?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know the answer. The news communication was all free. Well, my salary, bits of our salaries. So there was that. We tilted towards doing much more communication than we doing our normal jobs. But like everybody, we stopped doing a lot of our normal jobs. The only paid stuff we did was marketing. So we did quite a lot of advertising, particularly when we were locking everybody down, and then subsequently for vaccination. Again, we didn't use huge amounts of money because we used us. So I was in the TV adverts. People were really fed up. So I was on the screens at the railway stations telling people to stay home or telling people to get vaccinated. So a tiny fraction of the health service budget of 19 billion was spent on communicating, but some, and we used more marketing money than we had used pre-pandemic. We're now back to not doing that, and it's a problem. We're trying to vaccinate autumn booster doses now for over 65s, and we're struggling to get a marketing budget to be able to do that. So, but I don't know the actual number to answer your question.
But it's very tiny, but very effective.
Tiny. It's tiny. Somebody else would have to judge if it was effective.
Hi, I wanted to ask on the equity side, whenever you're trying to figure out how do I communicate this audience better, it's like also the possibilities of what you could do. And everyone takes energy and cost, and it's unknown how effective or what benefit would be. So how did you go about navigating those type of decisions and formulating strategies, and that basically decide what don't you do and what do you do when trying to do equity initiatives and communication?
Excellent. I did not plan that question, but that was that is to the heart of everything we do. I would like both of you to address it because that's so important. Amanda, you want to start off?
I can. So certainly, I think it differs, of course, like my experiences previously in journalism, right? So we would go through and say, look at our demographics, like who's reading us, who's not reading us. We'd be very strategic about who do we want in 10 years time. who do we want to be reading us? Who are we not reaching right now? Who we want to be reaching? And then we did a tremendous amount of audience research with those folks, right? So it's, again, this is like sort of forward looking. I think it's what we didn't have, you know, as a society, what we didn't have pre-pandemic, right? That kind of audience research to back it up, not just what you want to say, right? Because we had topics that we would cover and things like that, but that was very exploratory. What do they want to know, right? What matters to them? How would it, you know, how would our product fit to that market?
I think that my top, lots of tips, and it's a long conversation, but my principal learning is think of it like a pyramid structure. So if you have the information, there is a gradient of information, you have it. The community leaders probably don't have it. You have to communicate with the community leaders, not with the community. So do not try and communicate with the whole of the Polish community or the whole of the Gypsy traveller community. Find the trusted individuals within those communities. Now that community can be as big or as small as you like. It could be women, it could be young people, or it could be a housing scheme here that doesn't listen to anybody from outside. I don't care. Find whoever is the best communicator for that tribe, that group, and use them. So we have a thing in Scotland called Young Scot. Every single young person in Scotland has a card that gets them discounts in shops, that gets them discounted gym membership, gets them free bus travel. Young Scot is a big organisation, and they have a health panel, 15 people from a diverse set of backgrounds across the whole country. I speak to the health panel speak to the young people. Now, occasionally they bring me along for fun just to take the mickey out of me, and we do a Q&A, but it's up to them. I didn't choose when to do that. They chose when to do that. So the young people ran the young people's communication, because it turns out I don't know how young people communicate. I don't know where they get the news. I don't know how they communicate with each other. So they did it. We gave them the truth as we knew it at each time, to try and allow them to do that in an intelligent way with the community that they cared about. And that served us fairly well, whether it was a demographic group or a professional group or whatever it happened to be.
Excellent. You know, to add an editorial comment, we published actually several papers around issues of equities during and post-COVID, where one simple story, right? If we started talking about remote education, right? People are supposed to log in. If we have a family with 3 kids, 1 computer, and limited bandwidth in the household, just think about what kind of education can they provide, right? And this is a pulsing reality of millions of families all over the world, right? Somehow we did not talk about digital divide. We suddenly rediscovered digital divide during COVID-19. And we are still doing that because we are investing in rural America, but we are not investing in our neighborhoods. None of the policies are investing in our neighborhoods on promoting digital equity. You can go back and take a look at the policies, all the policies we have recently passed. So this is really critical and central to the post-COVID reality. So where do we go from here? This is the last question. We just have about a minute. Where do we go from here, each of you?
Yeah, I would like to, I think so much of the questions here and the focus during COVID were on journalists and how journalists help you as gatekeepers reach new audiences. And I'd like us, to think a little bit more broadly, sort of to Jason's last point, who are the new media gatekeepers? Who can you work with going forward to spread your message?
I think we have to mainstream health communication as a thing. Now, you'd be surprised that I would say that, because it was my job during the pandemic, and I tried to be that translator. But why shouldn't we do that around obesity, around malaria, around global health challenges, around climate change? And we're going to have trusted voices that the media, the journalists will draw on, who will have the truth in there. So if this institution can't prepare people for that, I'm not sure where they're going to go for that kind of preparation. That's not going to be for everybody. Some people will want to communicate using health service journals, and that's perfectly legitimate. But we need a subgroup of public health professionals to be able to speak to the populations that they serve, whether that's in Thailand, in Scotland, or in Massachusetts. So we've got to prepare those people to be able to do that. And that's not a skill that they'll have naturally. Like every skill, you can learn it and get better at it by learning with experts and trialing, speaking to your mum and your kids and your neighbours about how you might get this information over. So I think we need to mainstream the communication of health as well as the learning of public health itself.
Excellent. Amanda, Jason, thank you so much for sharing your insight. And I would be remiss if I did not thank each and every one of you for what you do. You know, you are all the people in the front lines working in the trenches, doing this work. It's very important work. So thank you, not only for this session, but for everything you do. And thank the team for organizing this. Thanks again.